Welcome to our AJA Lunchtime Live. Welcome to all of you lovely beings who are here with us live. Welcome to those of you who are joining the replay. Our topic today is the plant-based by default strategy. And we have Katie Cantrell of Greener by Default joining us. And we're going to be talking today about a very simple food policy being implemented in eating places and institutions around the world that's creating a dramatic increase in plant-based eating. So never take the simple things for granted because they can sometimes be the most powerful. Before we jump in though, I want to introduce Katie properly. So Katie Cantrell is the CEO of Greener by Default and a social entrepreneur passionate about creating healthy, sustainable, and a just food system. As the founder of the New Roots Institute, Katie spent a decade leading food policy workshops at universities, government agencies, and Fortune 500 corporations. She's now utilizing her expertise to implement plant-based defaults in institutional food service. Katie holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from UC Berkeley. Katie, welcome. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
And we have had your colleague, Alana Braverman, on a panel before. So we love what you're doing at Greener by Default. So super excited about this. So folks, Katie is going to give us a lowdown on the concept of plant-based by default for the first part of our time together. And then we're going to go into some, I'll be throwing some questions at Katie and also opening it up to you folks for some Q&A. So Katie, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kimberly. I'm really honored to be here with all of you. So again, my name is Katie Cantrell. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Greener by Default. And as Kimberly mentioned, prior to this, I founded what was known as the Factory Farming Awareness Coalition, is now New Roots Institute. And so just to give you a bit of my background, so I founded FFAC shortly after graduating from college because I was shocked at how few people knew anything about factory farming. Environmental groups weren't really talking about it at that time. It was only being presented as an animal rights issue. And I realized that that framing was kind of alienating to a lot of other groups, environmentalists, social justice activists, et cetera. And so I founded FFAC to educate people about factory farming from whatever perspective most related to them. So we had different versions tailored towards different audiences. And so basically, I spent about a decade giving very depressing presentations about, all of the horrors of factory farming. And I mean, it was very impactful work. I could see the light bulb go off in students' heads and, realize that they had been lied to and, the food system was so much different than they thought. But, we undoubtedly had a big impact and changed people's lives, but it was really hard work. It's hard to give people information that they would honestly rather not know. It's easier to remain in the dark. And so, I did start to get burned out after about a decade of doing that and had some personal things go on. I ended up taking a step back. The phenomenal Monica Chen has now taken over New Roots. And they've created a really fantastic community that's really building the movement by empowering students to become leaders. So it's taken on a much more specific and I think powerful focus. But, for me, I had a chance to kind of step back and reassess and think, what do I want to do now? And as Kimberly mentioned, I studied psychology in school. And so I was really taken by this concept of choice architecture, which is something that comes out of behavioral economics. And it's this idea that we can help people make the better choice just by making it the easy choice. We're so influenced by our environment and the way that choices are presented to us that sometimes that's all you need to change. You don't even need to get into all the depressing facts and figures and have some ideological battle to change someone's mind. You can just make something easier. And so that's really what I decided to focus on. The concept of plant-based by default or default veg was actually started by a British nonprofit called Creature Kind. And then the Better Food Foundation brought the idea and the campaign of default veg to the US. And so I started by working for the Better Food Foundation to bring this concept to corporations. They had mostly been working with students in universities. And interestingly, I got the feedback that the name default veg was too radical for corporate audiences, which seems silly, but even having veg in the name seemed like too much. And so I ended up rebranding as Greener by Default. We created this whole new website with an advisory board with a lot of corporate sustainability directors. And the the program really took off and kind of became its own thing. And so now we have spun off into our own separate nonprofit. So just to give you some background, because some of you have probably heard of the Default Veg campaign before. So we started as part of Default Veg, and now we've become our own thing. So with that for background, I will now dive in. This is basically our normal pitch deck that we use with a lot of audiences. So in terms of the setting the stage for why plant-based is important, I know that all of you know that already, but I thought that some of these facts and this framing might be useful for you to see how we talk about this with audiences who are not necessarily, again, interested in it from an animal perspective. We ourselves care very deeply about animal welfare and animal rights, but Greener by Default is very much not framed or billed as an animal rights organization.
Great, Katie. That's really helpful. Thank you so much for framing that for us.
Of course. So, just minimize on this. Okay. So our mission at Greener by Default is to empower institutions with evidence-based consulting and hands-on guidance to serve inclusive, sustainable, and delicious plant-forward food. So why are we focused on plant-forward food? When we think about threats to the environment, we tend to picture cars and smokestacks, not dinner. But the truth is, our need for food poses one of the biggest dangers to the planet. Globally, animal agriculture has an outsized impact. It uses 77% of all farmland, produces 57% of all food-associated greenhouse gas emissions, but produces only 37% of the world's protein. So plants actually produce most of the protein, while animals produce most of the environmental issues. The reason for this is that not all protein is created equal. So the food products with the highest carbon footprint are all animal products, and those with the lowest carbon footprint are plant-based proteins. Several studies now have shown that if we don't change the way that we eat, the food system alone could produce enough emissions to surpass 1.5 degrees of global warming. So this is actually really shocking when we stop and think about it, because it means that even if every other sector, so transportation, buildings, energy, became completely carbon neutral by 2050, but we keep eating the way that we're eating, we will still fail to meet the Paris Climate Accord. So in some ways, this is very disturbing and shocking, but in others, it's actually really empowering because food is one of the areas that we have the most direct control over and that can be changed the most quickly and affordably. So that brings us to the solution, which is serving more plant-based foods. On average, the greenhouse gas footprint of plant-based meals is half that of animal-based meals. This study looked at the impact of different sustainability interventions at events, because of course our food choices as individuals are important, but the food that's served at institutions has impacts hundreds or even thousands of times greater than our individual food choices because so many meals are being served at once. So this study found that by far the most effective intervention was switching from beef to veggie burgers. Second to that is just reducing the portion size of beef by 25%. Other initiatives we think of, like using recycled plastic or eliminating single-use plastic altogether, they're great for other environmental and social reasons, but from a carbon perspective, the impact is almost zero. And this is surprising because so often we see that in green meanings guides, they talk about how food is served using reusables or compostables, but not what food is served, even though that is by far the bigger impact. The good news is that the plant-based movement has exploded in the last 5 years. Plant-based menu items have increased 800%. 83% of food service operators believe that offering plant-based proteins helps to drive traffic into their restaurants. And 41% of consumers eat vegetarian or vegan dishes in food service at least once a week. Apologies, these are US specific stats, but I think that it's similar for Canada. Now, who is driving this growth? It is mostly young people and omnivores. So the most exciting stat, I think, is the one on the right, that 98% of consumers who buy plant-based meats also buy animal meat. This is actually great news because it means that the solution doesn't need to lie in trying to convince everyone to go totally vegan overnight, but rather encouraging this existing trend of so-called flexitarianism, which is getting omnivores to eat more plant-based meals more often, realizing that we don't need a huge hunk of meat at the center of our plate at every meal. And so this is really the focus of Greener by Default's work, is making it easier, more appealing, and more accessible for omnivores to choose plant-based options, really getting outside of this paradigm that vegetarian food is just for vegetarians. The way that we do this is rooted in behavioral economics, specifically the book Nudge, which looks at the impacts of defaults and nudges on human behavior. So Defaults are the option we end up with if we don't make an active choice. For instance, I will admit I still have the same ringtone that my cell phone came with. Many of you probably do as well. I simply never bothered to go into the settings to change it. People have a very strong tendency to stick with defaults, partly because it's the easiest option, it's one less choice to make, and partly because, as social creatures, we like to fit in. We have this subconscious assumption that if most people around us are doing something, it must be the right thing to do. And so the surest way to fit in with everyone else is to stick with the default. We know that that's what most people around us will be doing. A classic example of the power of defaults is organ donations. These are countries in Europe, and the ones on the left, by default, people are not organ donors and they have to actively opt into it. And you can see their participation rates top out around 25%. The countries on the right, people by default are organ donors and they have to actively opt out of it. And you can see their participation rates are close to 100%. Giving another example that's based in sustainability, this study looked at the energy sources that companies were using. So, in the control condition on the left in year one, companies were opted into traditional energy and they had the choice to request renewable energy. And you can see that all of them stuck with that conventional energy. Then for the study, they flipped it. They made renewable the default and gave businesses the choice to opt out into conventional energy. And you can see that about 75% of businesses stuck with renewable, and that was consistent year over year. So it's not like they were tricked, they didn't notice on their energy bill and then they switched back. They're perfectly happy to stick with renewables when it's the easy option. They just weren't going to go out of their way to request it. So when you combine these concepts of defaults and plant-based foods, you get greener by default. The core concept is simple. We are looking to flip the norm in institutional food service. Right now, just about everywhere, meat and dairy are the default. People have to specially opt into plant-based options, which again, usually only vegetarians and vegans bother to do. Our goal is to make plant-based the default and give people the choice to opt into meat and dairy. So it's a flexible strategy. There's different ways to implement it in different types of food service environments. It's cost effective and often cost savings. And critically, it preserves freedom of choice. So people who want or need animal protein have that option available to them. And so you don't get the same kind of backlash that you do to fully meatless menus. It's also a more inclusive way of serving food, and we don't necessarily associate inclusivity with food offerings in the cafeteria, but feeling confident that you can sit down with your coworkers, with your friends, and enjoy a delicious and nutritious meal that meets all of your dietary needs is a powerful form of inclusivity. And having meat and dairy with every meal is not inclusive of the 30, and again, apologies for the US specific stats, the 30 to 50 million Americans who are lactose intolerant, the many different religions that encourage vegetarianism or restrict certain animal products, and communities of color who are nearly 3 times more likely to identify as vegetarian or vegan. So, by making plant based the default and giving people the choice to opt into meat and dairy, that includes everyone by default. This is also a highly effective strategy. My co-founder, Alana Braverman, helped to lead a study with researchers from Harvard and UCLA and other universities looking at student meal choice at on-campus events. So in the control condition on the left, just like pretty much everywhere, meat was the default and students could select a plant-based meal, request a plant-based meal. So you can see that about 80% of students stuck with meat when it was the default. Then for the study, they flipped it and made plant-based the default and gave people the choice to request a meat meal. And you can see that about 2/3 of people stuck with plant-based, about a third requested meat. So this is an almost 50 percentage point increase in the number of people eating plant-based meals simply by changing the language on the registration forms. Now you'll notice a third of people did go out of their way to request meat, and these are the people who would have raised hell if this had been a fully vegan event. But they had their needs met, they could opt into meat, and the vast majority of people were happy to stick with plant-based when it was the default. But again, they weren't going to go out of their way to request it, but they're happy to stick with it. And so that reflects really what we see with most audiences and most diners, which is that, on one side you have the vegans, the strict vegans who will go out of their way to request a vegan meal. On the other side, you have the meat lovers who are going to complain if there's not meat. But most people fall into this middle ground, these flexitarians who are happy to eat plant-based when it's easy, when it's delicious, when it's appealing, when other people around them are doing it. And so that is really our focus, again, is activating these flexitarians to enjoy plant-based foods. So what does this actually look like in practice? Again, the core concept is to make plant-based the default and give people the choice to opt into meat and dairy. So on restaurant menus, or if there's a printed menu, this looks like having the entrees plant-based and having a choice to request to add on meat or dairy, or maybe a note at the bottom, like if it's burgers saying, this by default comes with an impossible patty, let us know if you would prefer a beef patty. And so studies have found that diners choosing from a plant-based default menu were over 7 times more likely to select a plant-based meal than your standard menus, which have mostly meat options and some plant-based options. All right. Now, if it's not possible to make the base of the meal plant-based, we recommend climate-friendly ratios, which is offering at least 2 plant-based options for every animal-based option. And this is based on studies that have found that when the menu shifts from two-thirds meat to two-thirds veg entrees, selection of veg meals increases by 22 percentage points or 56% overall. Part of the reason for this is that when there's just 1 or 2 veg options and a bunch of meat options, the omnivores see those veg options and think, oh, those are just for the vegetarians. I'll stick with a normal meat option. And sometimes that's even altruistic. I talk to a lot of people, especially in workplaces that order catering, where the veg options run out right away. And so if omnivores are taking those veg options, it means that a vegetarian is going hungry. They won't have anything to eat. And so the omnivores are actively discouraged from taking the veg options. But of course, we want to encourage everyone to choose them because, again, they are more sustainable. So, when there's an abundance of different plant based options and a few meat options, then suddenly it becomes more about the flavors and the ingredients. Am I in the mood for a chickpea curry or black bean enchiladas or spaghetti with meatballs? Then it's not about whether or not I personally identify as a vegetarian. Another really easy strategy is what we call subtle substitutions. So, serving plant based condiments, milks, desserts, and breads by default. So, as I'm sure most of you know, these are indistinguishable these days. And actually, we found that in blind taste tests, sometimes people even prefer the taste of vegan baked goods like brownies and cookies. And actually, there was a school district in Colorado that removed eggs and milk from all of their baked goods across the entire school district, replaced them with oil and flax seeds and bananas. And they are saving more than $10,000 annually, and they cut their carbon footprint by as much as driving over 50,000 miles. So this is a very simple but effective intervention. And we're finding a lot of interest in this, especially right now with avian flu coming back seasonally, making eggs more expensive, causing disruptions in the supply chain. This is one less headache for dining directors, then they don't have to worry about what portion of their budget eggs are going to take up or where they're going to source them from. Another really easy strategy is making sure that plant-based options are listed as part of the main menu or in the main buffet line rather than being separated and being offered first and last. And this is based on a study that World Resources Institute did and found that this strategy increased selection of plant-based items by 56%. So in this image, on the right, you can see there's the normal menu up top and then a separate vegetarian menu below. And so if I'm an omnivore looking at this, I think, oh, that's the vegetarian section for the vegetarians. I'm not a vegetarian. I'll stick with the normal menu. Whereas when the veg options are incorporated into the main menu on the left, I glance at that menu. The first thing that catches my eye is risotto primavera. That sounds delicious. I'll have that. I might not even think about the fact that it's vegetarian. And I do want to add that some of these strategies that we're recommending are a bit at odds with what vegans want. So these strategies are really geared towards encouraging flexitarians to choose plant-based foods. They're focused on non-vegans. What we find sometimes it's funny is that if you're catering to a vegan audience, it's nicer for us to have a separate menu because then we can feel more confident to know that it is vegan. And also we want the word vegan as prominently as possible. But it turns out that that is actually a huge turnoff to non-vegans. So this is our other key strategy, which is labeling dishes with really enticing names that stimulate the senses and focus on ingredients and flavors and provenance rather than using terms like vegan. So a study from World Resources Institute found this approach increased sales by 76%. And again, vegans love it if it's vegan is written in huge neon letters. But for omnivores, they see that and think, oh, it's just for vegans, it's not for me. Or they might think, oh, it's not going to taste as good, it won't be as filling, it won't be as decadent. But if they just see the flavors and ingredients and don't even think about the fact that it's vegan, they're much more likely to choose it. So um, a good analogy for this is if you see a celiac bowl on a menu, you're probably not going to select it unless you are strictly gluten-free. But if you see a Thai peanut rice noodle bowl, if you like those flavors, you're going to choose it and not even think about the fact that it's gluten-free. So we use a strategy with a software company that changed the name of their vegetarian hummus wrap to roasted red pepper avocado hummus wrap, and sales immediately increased. So sometimes it just takes the simplest changes for dishes that are already on the menu to increase sales among all diners. Okay, so what does this look like in practice? And actually, um, I'm realizing that I think I forgot to check the little box to share my volume, so I'm going to stop sharing for just a second and then start again.
This is all great, Katie. So much great information. Thank you so much. I'm madly taking notes.
Well, thank you. Okay, there we go. I think that should work now. Okay, so this is a video about a pilot that we did in LinkedIn San Francisco office. Let me know if the volume still doesn't work, but hopefully it will. And hopefully it will load. Well,
Maybe just try refreshing it.
oops. Okay, well, I can share a link to the video in the chat. We have it available online. All right, let's keep going. So, and I can basically summarize the LinkedIn pilot. So we used basically all of the strategies that I just talked about. We also implemented an oat milk default in their coffee bar. That's another really great and easy strategy. So usually, when you order a latte, it's assumed you want dairy milk unless you specially request a plant-based milk. We just flipped it. So they have a sign up saying oat milk is the default. Let us know if you would prefer dairy, almond, or soy milk. And so between all these strategies, they cut the amount of meat they were serving per person in half. The amount of dairy served was decreased by more than half. And so it cut the carbon footprint from those proteins and dairies also in half. And no change in diner satisfaction from before the pilot to during the pilot. So hugely successful. And our other big initial pilot was with New York City Health and Hospitals, which some of you may have heard of. So we implemented a plant-based default initially for patient lunches in all 11 hospitals, and it was so successful that they've now expanded it to all patient meals in all public New York City hospitals. And so basically how it works is there they have verbal menus and they have 2 daily chef specials. And so patients are first offered the first chef special. If they don't want that, they're offered the other chef special. If they don't want either of those, then there's a static menu of options that they can choose from. And so prior to our work, both of the chef specials were meat-based, except on Mondays. And so people really had to specially request a plant-based option. But now both of the chef specials are plant-based. And then if people don't want either of those, there are meat-based options for them to choose from. So more than half of all patients are choosing one of these plant-based chef specials. Very high rates of satisfaction with these meals. They're saving nearly 60 cents per meal, which equates to about $500,000 per year. Shifting over 800,000 meals annually from meat-based to plant-based, and they've reduced the carbon footprint of their entire food service program by a third. So again, hugely successful. We also work with events. So we advise the event planner for the New York Times Climate Forward event on the language they used on the RSVP form to implement a plant-based default. So saying something like, in line with our commitment to sustainability and inclusivity, food will be plant-based by default. Please let us know if you would like to request a meat meal. And this event had even more dramatic results than most of the ones that we see. 96% of attendees chose the plant-based meal, which usually, it's about 5 to 10%. So I think especially because this was a climate event, people really felt a moral obligation to stick with the plant-based default. Also, they might not have wanted to stand out as one of the few people who did opt in to meet. Um, and this is, yeah. So again, these huge impacts just by making some simple language changes on registration forms. All right, so just wrapping up, again, this can work in any food setting, employee or public facing conferences and meetings, dining halls, cafeterias, restaurants, cafes, and micro kitchens. And the way that we work with institutions is first we conduct a menu audit. So we look at the existing food service environment, we look at the existing menus, and we determine where are the best areas of opportunity, where can we make the most impact with the lowest amount of effort. And so then we work with the client, with the institution to decide which strategies they want to test. We recommend doing this as a pilot because these are pretty big changes and they can be a little bit scary. And so we found that it's an easier ask to pitch a pilot and get them to test them and make sure that they have the desired effects rather than just blindly committing to implementing them permanently. For instance, at one tech company we worked with the subtle substitutions idea, the dining director was flabbergasted that we were suggesting only serving vegan cookies. He was saying, even to the VIPs, the C-suite, when we have guests coming in, you expect me to serve them vegan cookies? And I said, just try it for a month, make the cookies vegan, don't change the name of them, call them chocolate chip or oatmeal raisin or whatever. But in the allergens, they just won't have dairy and eggs. And, of course, no one noticed. So sometimes, the stakeholders have their own preconceptions and it can help them to get over it by testing this out. And so we also work with the food service team to really support them through the pilot process. Um, we don't do a lot of like recipe development or menuing in-house, but we recommend Forward Food Program of the Humane Society, or HSI, has fantastic recipe resources, chef training videos. So we connect culinary teams with resources if they need them. And then finally, we help them collect and analyze data to calculate carbon savings and diner satisfaction and potentially cost savings as well. Again, it's great for the client and for us to be able to see these strategies are really working as intended and diners are happy with the food. And that gives them the confidence to permanently implement these strategies. This is just a sample of some of the institutions that we've worked with. And that's it. So this is our website. We have a lot of resources on there about all of the studies that I referenced. So all of the different research, that's the groundwork for the strategies that we recommend, and also some other materials. So please visit our website, and this is our email address. And now I look forward to taking your questions.
Fabulous, Katie. Thank you so much. Yeah, so succinct in just really lining this up on why this is just such a like, again, simple, powerful concept, and what the results are incredible. So I'm going to take some questions that came up in the chat and that are coming up in the chat, and just folks, so just so you know that if you have a question, just make sure you put like star 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 Q before your question, just to differentiate it from the rest of the chat. And so, Katie, a couple of things that I just like really hit me is 83% of food service leaders thought plant-based options would increase their biz. Like, first of all, that was flabbergasting for me. I was like, that's really great that so many see that. Has that been a change, would you say, in the last little while?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a change that we've seen over maybe the last 5 years. And that stat we actually just got from the Plant-Based Foods Association. They have a lot
Amazing.
of great statistics, yeah.
So it's just really an important piece for us to know, especially if we're taking this idea to a restaurant, a local restaurant, is that there are a lot of people who run restaurants are in the know about this. They get it. They get that this is probably a trend that they should not be letting pass them by. The other thing, I mean, just the organ donor default level, like, unbelievable. We're lazy as humans, huh? We're very lazy.
Yeah. There's another example that I love. where insurance companies had really been trying to get doctors to prescribe generic medications instead of brand names because the brand name is very expensive both for the patient and the insurance company. They had done all these educational campaigns telling doctors how much it was costing their patients, but doctors remember the brand name. Like that's easy to remember. They don't necessarily remember the generic. And so someone actually in the IT department on the back end at this hospital changed the like prescription program so that when they started to type in the brand name, it would automatically fill in the generic unless the doctor kind of overrode it and said, no, actually, I want to do the brand name. And immediately, like, that's all it took, making generic the default. And suddenly, almost all prescriptions were for generic. So, huge educational campaigns couldn't accomplish it, but like one change to the ordering system and it's done.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, some of the questions that are coming up. So Jeremy is asking, what's your success rate, percentage for organizations saying yes to making plant-based the default? How do you often get feedback for why they say no? So, and how does it work? Do you approach them? Do you have your sort of hit list, or do they come to you, or how does it work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we are working very opportunistically right now. This is still a very novel and pretty radical strategy, honestly. I mean,
Mhm.
the effects are great, but the idea of making plant-based the default is a huge change. And so, right now, we're kind of working with the most progressive institutions, those that are sort of on the vanguard. They've already made very strong sustainability commitments. They're already seeing a lot of demand for plant-based. They get why this is really beneficial for them. And so um we kind of have to work with those who are already on the front lines of this. And so we do get institutions coming to us. We also always look for internal allies. So oftentimes, like with hospitals, for instance, we'll get a nurse or a doctor who's heard about New York City and saying, I want to bring that to my hospital. And so we work with these internal stakeholders. At corporations, often it's green teams, or if there's a vegetarian employee resource group, they'll come to us and say, how can we do this at our company? And so for us, it's really critical to have those internal stakeholders. Partly because that's who the institution cares about. Those are their diners. That's, who they are going to listen to. They don't care what some third party nonprofit thinks. They care what their own employees think. And then also those internal stakeholders really help us navigate the bureaucracy because that's another thing that can be really challenging with big institutions of all kinds is that there's usually a food service management company who's actually the ones producing the food. There's someone in facilities or operations who oversees that contract. Sometimes there's like worksite wellness or employee satisfaction. So it's really complicated basically to even figure out like who has the authority to sign off on a pilot like this. And so having someone on the inside who can navigate, like figuring out who do we need to even be at the table, who should be part of these meetings, and also kind of figuring out like who are the allies here, who are people high up in the company who are really passionate about sustainability, who might, be good advocates for this, who can we pull in? And so that's really right now our focus is working on institutions where we have those internal allies.
Amazing. We have Eleanor Carrera in the crowd, and who has been working on the Canadian University Initiative. And she said, "Greener by Default and Forward Food were instrumental in the success we've had with that program. Thank you."
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's an example. Eleanor was just like, "Hey, here's a gap," and she came to you folks and Forward Food, HSI Canada, which we'll give you a little bit more information on in a second, and said, give me all the resources, right? Like, let me, how do we do this?
Yeah.
So yeah, so
And
that's
huge props to Eleanor and what she's done. It's really incredible the impact that she's had, and we've been honored to play a little role in that.
amazing. Matt is asking, I think the question is, are there bigger margins for businesses, lower cost for institutions? Like, has that been shown? I saw a couple of stats around that, around the institutions. How about businesses?
Yes, so the food costs do tend to be lower. It depends a lot on what food was being served and what food they switched to. So, if they're serving like the cheapest commodity meat and they switch to serving Impossible burgers, costs will go up. But if they switch from beef to beans, or if they're serving, more expensive organic or regenerative meat, which we often see in like corporate cafeterias like LinkedIn, for instance. I mean, they were sourcing like the highest welfare, local, regeneratively grown animal products that were very expensive. And so they saved a lot of money switching to plant-based proteins. New
And is
York
that a
City.
big motivator for them, Katie? Like, does that help? Is money a motivator for these places that you're working with?
Yeah, it definitely is. And I mean, it gets a little bit complicated because it depends on the contract. Like often if it's a food service management company, they're saving that money, but they have a food budget that's set, that's fixed. And
Mhm.
so what we saw like at LinkedIn is they were able to use that savings to then purchase more organic, local, when they were purchasing animal products, purchasing like higher welfare, sustainable seafood is what they allocated it towards. So really like that concept of less meat, better meat, that those savings can then be reallocated to buy higher quality foods or more local foods, et cetera. Um, it gets tricky, like with events, that's where the cost savings doesn't get passed on.
Mm.
We see that like with hotels, that sometimes even though the base ingredients are cheaper, they might even charge more because it's not a standard item that's on their menu, or it's something that, they have to retrain their chefs. So sometimes the cost is the same or even greater with like a caterer or a restaurant, for instance. So the cost savings is really context dependent. And something else that I've learned in the process of doing this work is it is often a higher labor cost. So sometimes there is legitimacy in charging the same amount for like a homemade veggie burger. They have to peel and chop all those vegetables and then process them. And, they're caramelizing onions that go in that veggie burger. So that actually takes a lot more time and a lot more labor than taking a hamburger patty and throwing it on the grill. So sometimes when you factor in labor costs, it can even out. But we do see that overall, especially if they're using whole food plant-based proteins, that there is often a cost savings in terms of food ingredients. Also, I realized I didn't actually answer that first question. I was kind of laying the groundwork. But in terms of the percentage of institutions that say yes, we're trying to calculate that right now. It's a really long process. So it often takes like 6 to 9 months of discussion, sometimes up to a year, between when we find that internal ally to, having phone calls and meetings and sending email reminders to when we actually get the green light to start a pilot. There's bumps along the way, or, the food service director changes. And so we don't even one of our goals for this year is just to figure out what is that percentage of institutions that say yes. Um, but I would say that when it doesn't work out, it's usually just a matter of priorities that, I mean, unfortunately with the tech sector, there's been economic issues, so their sustainability teams are being fired. There have been labor shortages in food service since COVID. It's still ongoing, so sometimes they're short-staffed. They just don't have the capacity to take on a new project. So luckily, it's usually not an ideological issue. It's just more of a, we don't have the capacity for this right now.
Mm. Oh, I lost my camera for some reason. There I am. Great. Well, so Katie, Jay is bringing up just about the sort of the health benefits, and I did notice that that wasn't really part of your presentation. You did talk about inclusivity, which obviously involves some health aspects, but just curious, there must be a reason why you're avoiding the health aspect in that.
Yeah, so we do. I mean, we actually have a separate presentation for
Okay.
hospitals and healthcare institutions, and as you might, as you might assume, that one is heavily focused on health. With corporations and universities, because our intro point tends to be green teams or the sustainability director, we focus on sustainability. So I think it actually could be a viable path to come into it through worksite wellness. That's just not that hasn't been what we've done so far, but something that I think we probably will likely try is putting together materials that are focused on wellness and trying to use a different entry point, just not what we've done thus far.
Okay, so yeah, there was so I just wanted to know is the new strategy we don't talk about health? So good to know.
Yeah.
Um,
We're big
now,
fans of, framing it to fit whoever your audience is and whatever they
right.
care about.
Absolutely. And Katie, I loved that I love the piece about pilot. I think that was a really important, that's a really important piece because this is a big undertaking. Like we're like, oh yeah, this is simple, this is great, and it is in some ways, but for an institution that means changing the way they do everything. It's huge.
Mhm.
And so yeah, so I think the pilot did it. So that's you always do things starting with a pilot.
Yes, I mean, 9 times out of 10,
Mhm.
that's what institutions are comfortable with, and that's what we recommend.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more? I mean, the New York hospitals, huge win. And I'm just wondering if you can tell us, we're a bunch of strategy nerds here. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that all came to be?
Yes, so, I mean, really, the credit for getting that program implemented is all goes to Mayor Eric Adams and his administration. So, for those of you who don't know, Mayor Eric Adams is vegan or mostly vegan, and he actually wrote a book on reversing his diabetes and all of these health issues, like extreme health problems. He probably would have had to have limbs amputated. He was going blind. But now he's healthy thanks to a whole food plant-based diet. And so he is like a huge evangelist for plant-based diets as a public health initiative. And so, um, as soon as he won, um, as soon as they knew that he was going to become mayor, they knew that that was a big priority for him. And so his administration started having conversations with New York City Health and Hospitals, with the CEOs of the individual hospitals, and just sort of laying the groundwork for, again, piloting it and testing it out. And so um, then they brought us in basically when folks were already bought in. So we didn't really have to do any of the convincing, and from what I understand, there actually wasn't a lot of pushback. The hospitals were excited to try it. They were already doing Meatless Mondays, and they use Sodexo as their food service management company, and Sodexo is really phenomenal and kind of on the front lines of promoting plant-based. Their culinary director, Chef Phil, just amazing, like jumped at the challenge to try to make really culturally appropriate plant-based meals that like Puerto Rican dishes. They have a large Puerto Rican population, making really like comfort foods that would be recognizable to patients, but doing them plant-based. So he did a phenomenal job with those menus, and that's a huge part of the reason it's been so successful. But yeah, it was really a wonderful experience because everyone was excited about it and people were, genuinely invested in it. Their dietitian, Samantha, also was really excited about plant-based nutrition and the benefits there. Um, they also have a really amazing lifestyle medicine program for outpatients for longer term care. Dr. McMacken manages that. So yeah, just a really phenomenal group of people.
Mm, sounds like a dream team. I'm very apologize everybody for my video. It's for some reason I don't know what's going on. So I've got all my programs closed. I promise. So sorry, Katie. You're a champion. Well, I'm coming in and out.
No problem.
Okay, so what we have here now is we have a bunch of people who are absolutely like frothing at the mouth to do this, okay, to take it into their institutions, their restaurants, all that sort of thing. What are the first steps? So okay, so first of all, we have greener by default. You're in the US, but you do help with and we have Americans here, we have people in the UK, we have people from all over, but we do have a lot of Canadians here. So sort of first steps if they're looking to do an institution, like restaurants, if they are just wanting to do more sort of individual greener by default sort of or plant-based by default advocacy, like they want to go into their local restaurant. What tell us a little bit of some of the resources that are out there for these folks.
Yes, so we actually we're in the process of getting a new materials page up on our website that will have kind of DIY guides, like one pagers for, if you're catering a meeting with a buffet, like this is what you can do. For restaurants, here's the top tips. That's not publicly available on our website yet, but we do have a lot of those resources. So if folks want to get in touch and just email us, we can send you, if you let us know like what is the food environment, we can send you resources for the top strategies to recommend.
Amazing. And Katie, I know that Better Food Foundation works on a little bit more of um, a little bit more of a less institutional level. Is that right? Can you tell us the difference between like if they should be reaching out to you or they should be reaching out to Forward Food or they should be reaching out to Better Food Foundation?
Yeah, so we all work in tandem. Better Food Foundation is really great for kind of grassroots campaigns. They work a lot with students at universities. They also have a whole campaign and materials for coffee shops for implementing oat milk defaults at coffee shops. So if you want to try to get, your local place where you get a latte every day, try to get them to do an oat milk default. Better Food Foundation has resources for that. And they're also doing a lot of work with municipalities, with cities and with governments, trying to get this into climate action plans and things like that. And then um, Forward Food has phenomenal recipe and culinary databases. So, if you have an institution that says we're interested, but we don't know how to do this or we don't have enough recipes, that's the place that we always send them.
Amazing. So yeah, so if somebody's an insider in an institution, they should either get in touch with Forward Food, HSI Canada, or you, or both. If somebody is wanting to do sort of more local type things, get in touch with Better Food Foundation.
Mhm.
And yeah, and if people are interested in hospitals and things like that, who would that be? You folks?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, hospitals are where we've really seen the most traction because of
Okay.
New York City. It's such a huge
Yeah.
win, and there's such great data. Also, I can't tell you who yet, but in just a couple of weeks, we're going to have a big announcement about a Canadian hospital that has been piloting plant-based
Wonderful.
defaults.
Ooh, how
Yeah, yeah,
exciting.
for that press release is coming out in a couple weeks, but hopefully that will get a lot of momentum going in Canada.
Yeah, I love that. That's amazing. Okay, so a few more questions. Everybody loved your presentation. Is there anything like that available for people to do their own presentations? To get interest in the topic, or should they just show people this YouTube video that we're gonna get?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
um,
mean, get in touch if we like to keep track of who's using it and in
yeah,
what context, so we don't just
absolutely.
have it publicly available, but we do share it, for people to use, or we can, share certain slides if people are pitching to stakeholders.
Amazing. Emily is saying, I work at UCSF and it's a behemoth. Wonder what you recommend as a starting point to get this conversation going with sustainability offices or food services.
Yeah, so we have had a bit of contact with ECSF's dining director. He was not super enthused about the concept, and that is something that we see, unfortunately, is we do encounter people at all levels who are really passionate about sustainable meat and that regenerative is the answer, and they don't believe in plant-based. And so right now we're really just again being opportunistic and not trying to fight people who are not interested. So we sort of have not prioritized UCSF because their dining director didn't seem receptive. But I mean, if you can build internal pressure, then maybe it would be worth revisiting. So yeah, I think connecting with a green team, um, again, just trying to like find your natural allies. If there's lifestyle medicine program or doctors or nurses, they're often really passionate about food as medicine. So that can be a good place to start. And I'm happy to chat more with you. We do a lot of webinars, like lunch and learns, basically what you saw today to build support for the program before pitching it to stakeholders. So that could be a possibility.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit about building pressure within? You said green teams and everything. If I'm not mistaken, and you can weigh in on this, Eleanor, but I feel like there was some push from the student populations as far as requesting this, sending letters to the deans and things like that. So, is that the sort of thing that really can help? Is a little bit of a grassroots push in an institution?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from Eleanor. She's
Yeah, yeah.
here.
But that's the sort of thing you're talking about, right,
Yeah.
Katie? Yeah,
Yeah, and
okay.
that's something that like Greener by Default doesn't lead that work. Better
Yeah.
Food Foundation can do more of like mentoring students and
Uh,
advising them as they go about that. But yeah, that can definitely be helpful.
Amazing. Let's see. Mary is asking, with a pilot project, do you recommend leaving off the V? So I think she means the little V in brackets. Now, I think Katie, the V is okay to be there. It's just it has to be a small part. Like I just want to make sure people understand. It doesn't have to, we don't have to hide it. We just can't it can't be neon, blinking sort of vegan, right?
Yes, and actually, I mean, for people who are vegan, it's important that there is some kind of identifier there. And
Yeah.
just logistically, if there's nothing, then the food service staff end up getting asked, but like, is this vegan? Is this vegetarian?
Yeah.
They don't always know. Then they have to go back and ask the chef, and it causes a line to build up. So yeah, we find it is very important to have some kind of, whether it's a little leaf or a little V, just something subtle so that people who are looking for it can find it, but it's not going to grab the attention of people who aren't looking for it.
Mm. Katie, what about, this inclusive element just feels so obvious, and in this day and age of being so much more aware of racial justice, do you feel like the understanding of this aspect is starting to expand for folks running things? Like for example, having dairy in everything is a little bit racist, kind of thing.
I mean, I find that it does resonate when we talk about it, but I think it's still we get a lot of people like, "Oh, like I'd never
Mhm.
thought about that at that slide."
Right.
So I think that's kind of a newer area of understanding for people. There's still a lot of stereotypes about who the vegans in the room would be, that it's these like bougie young white people or the hippies or, not
Right.
realizing that.
Whereas we know that at least in the United States, that Black Americans are the fastest growing vegan population there is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one last question, because I'm curious just about these trends that you're probably really on top of. The freedom of choice thing, it's gotta just be so huge, especially since the pandemic. I mean, that is such a political movement right now, this freedom of choice. Would you say that's like one of the big pillars of why this food policy is sort of getting through where others aren't?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, unfortunately, because I've been doing work in this field for a long time, I've seen a lot of institutions that have had to cancel Meatless Mondays because there's so much backlash. And people do barbecues in the parking lot on Mondays, and it becomes this flashpoint that's like it's illogical. Like it's one day, it's one meal, but it there's like this principle that people don't like having their freedom of choice taken away. They don't like having something forced onto them. It feels very patronizing. They're being treated as children that can't even make their own food decisions. It just brings up all of these very negative emotions. And so we just sidestep all of that. So, and I mean, whether there's people who are paleo or like it's rare, but there are people who are like allergic to all legumes and all nuts and soy. And like there are certain people who, for medical reasons, need meat or want it. And so, again, like in the spirit of inclusivity, there is truly something for everyone. And so, both in terms of the diner reactions and for the stakeholders to realize, like, okay, we are giving people what they need and want. We don't have to feel bad or feel afraid that there's going to be so much anger.
Amazing. Yeah. And actually, I lied. I'm going to ask you one more question because you're somebody who has worked in communications around plant-based for a long time, around animal rights, plant-based. And so if somebody is trying to bring this to an organization, they find themselves in a convo with people, making around making their event or their menu default vegan. What are some pointers on how to make that a successful convo? Especially if there is that defensiveness coming up.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And this is, it's important because, yeah, people do tend to get defensive around food. It's a very
Mhm.
personal, very emotional issue. So, I mean, I think, first of all, like I was saying earlier, to really try to frame it around their interests, both what they're passionate about and their self interest. So, if they care a lot about health, speak to health. Also, actually, we are changing our pitch deck. This was our general pitch deck, but we got the feedback from a marketing expert that unless we're speaking to a green team, like if we're speaking to operations and dining people, they don't even necessarily care about global climate change. So we're actually changing our pitch deck to take out the slides on the global situation and just speaking to their own self-interest in terms of cost savings, in terms of employee wellness and productivity, inclusivity. Those are the things that resonate. Attracting talent, because so many young people are looking for plant-based options, are looking for employers who are truly taking action on climate. So being able to attract and retain talent, those are the types of things that employers care about, that companies care about. It's different for hospitals. But yeah, just know your audience. I'd say speak to their interests and try to meet them where they are. And remember that, not everyone knows this stuff. I know it can be so hard for those of us who have been steeped in it for so long. Like, how can you not see this? But, I mean, people are coming from a place of having been told all of these, lies, and like there's so much propaganda from the meat industry that's everywhere. And so just recognizing that it's not necessarily a reflection of that person, like their ethics or they're a bad person or anything like that, but like they're coming from a very different perspective. They have a very different body of knowledge. And so, if you can even move them a little bit, being very friendly, being very accepting, kind of combating those stereotypes of the angry vegan, that can be powerful in and of itself. That even if you don't get what you want, if it's a positive conversation, if they feel good walking away from it, they're more likely to come back to you and want to talk with you about it later. And so that, planting those seeds for future wins, even if you can't get what you're asking for right now.
That's such great advice, Katie. I always say we're planting the seeds, folks,
Yeah.
planting the seeds. And whenever you're trying to look for a win on the spot, you're going to lose. You're going to lose. Just especially if it's an ongoing relationship. It's a relationship.
Yeah.
And relationships build. So thank you for that. Tenebrae has been in the chat and was saying universal meals. We should call it universal meals. I think it's a great idea.
Well, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine actually has a universal meals program.
Ah,
So the name is taken,
amazing.
and we do refer hospitals especially to that as well. They're recipes for meals that are free of all of the top 9 allergens. So they are
Amazing.
plant-based but also free of soy and nuts and dairy. And so those are truly inclusive and truly universal.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And folks, we do that are in Canada, we do have a program at which we've mentioned a couple times. It's called Forward Food. We're great friends with them. They do really great work too, mostly with institutions. And so that's a really good place to get resourced as well. But if people are looking for stats and they're looking for some things to be able to sort of do their own thing to get the roll rolling, Katie, says you're good to reach out to them and help. They'll help you out with that. So, all right, well, let's bring us back to the gallery view so that Katie can see everybody. We have had some very engaged people for this hour, and I just want everybody to give Katie a great big AJ. Thank you. Amazing. Katie, thank you for all the amazing work that you're doing. And we're so excited about this concept, and we're so excited about the work you're doing at Greener by Default.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And likewise, it's so exciting to see the community that you have here. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, they're good uns. And speaking of that, folks, don't forget to join us. We'll be sending out information about this panel happening in 2 weeks, Wednesday the 13th, and it's about how do we get people to care more for fishes. So make sure you join us. We haven't had a panel for a little while, an evening panel, so it'll be great. And don't forget, folks, if you love what we're doing here, don't forget to support AJA and our programming. Kirsten will put a little link in there for that. And also make sure that you're following us on social media. And if you're not already on our email list to get notices of our events, make sure to sign up for free at animaljusticeacademy.com. All right, thanks for all showing up and with your beautiful faces. Thank you, Katie, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Bye.